Next, Sitting at 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
Good afternoon. I'm Harriet Watson, President of the City Club of Portland, and as always, it's my privilege to welcome you to another Friday program. Today we'll be focusing on Oregon's election laws, beginning with a flashback to the most recent presidential election last November. I'd first like to recognize some special guests who are on their way or who are just now arriving to join us today. There are 5 members from the Lincoln High School Constitution class who are with us today. They've just competed in the National Constitution competition, where they placed 3rd in the nation. And of course, one of their questions was about the 2000 election and the Electoral College. One of their coaches, Steve Griffith, who's a City Club member, is with us today as well. So thank you, Steve, for your good work for City Club and with the Lincoln team. Next Friday, May 4th, please join us for a special program that focuses on Portland's ongoing 150th anniversary. Carl Abbott, historian, author, and professor of urban planning at Portland State University, will be with us to talk about the subject of his latest book, Portland Civic Culture, a Retrospective. Joining Carl in the discussion will be pollster Adam Davis of Davis & Hibbets and artist Tad Savinar. That will be here at the MAC. And then the following Friday, May 11th, please note in the program bulletin, that program will be held in Pioneer Courthouse Square, and it will feature Portland's soon-to-be public market. All reservations for the May 11th program must be prepaid, so please fill out the form in your bulletin or call the club office as soon as possible to make your reservations. This has already generated quite a bit of interest. And as always, Nancy would like me to remind you to direct yourself to the City Club website at www.pdxcityclub.org, where you can find out information about upcoming programs, archives of past programs, and any number of opportunities for you to become engaged further with the City Club of Portland. As most of you probably already know, Dan Goldie, one of the club's most dedicated members, died last week. Dan's memorial service is scheduled for 4 o'clock the afternoon of Sunday, April 29th. It will be at the World Forestry Center. Dan would have loved the subject of today's program, and I'm certain would have been here and would have had some kind of a niggling question for our speaker. So I would like to take this opportunity and dedicate today's program to Dan's memory. Up until, just maybe a few days before he died, he was still calling Nancy with questions and comments, and was still very active on 2 club committees. Our board host today is Tom Deering, member of the Board of Governors and retired attorney with Stoll Reeves. Tom will ask the first question. Following Tom's question, we will then open the program to questions from City Club members in the audience. Please line up behind the microphone even before Tom is finished so that we will have time for as many questions as possible. Please identify yourself as a City Club member, and please limit your question to 30 seconds or less. I also would encourage you not to ask any follow-up questions unless you see there is still ample opportunity for additional questions and no one is waiting to ask a first question. I'm also going to encourage our guests from Lincoln High School, if you have a question, to come forward as well. Broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible in part by corporate underwriting from Kaiser Permanente Health System, Wells Fargo Bank, and Portland General Electric. I'll not get that one wrong again. We are very grateful for their ongoing support. If no one knows what I was referring to, I'll tell you after the program. And now to today's program with Oregon Secretary of State and Chief Elections Officer Bill Bradbury. First, I'd like to commend members of the program committee for their scheduling acumen and having Secretary Bradbury with us today amid the incessant punditry surrounding President Bush's 100th day in office. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking to a friend who actually lives in Florida, and he said that many of his colleagues are still shaking their heads in disbelief that they voted for Buchanan. One colleague in particular, and this might be apocryphal, but I choose to believe it, my friend said his colleague was additionally downcast because his son, a flesh and blood dimpled Chad, has had to endure numerous bad puns and assaults on his name and integrity. The recent presidential election highlighted the importance of election laws and procedures. The question before us today is, could the debacle in Florida happen here in Oregon? One of Secretary Bradbury's articulated priorities is to protect the integrity of Oregon's election process and to increase voter turnout. Please join me in welcoming Secretary of State Bill Bradbury as he leads us in a discussion of the differences between the Florida and Oregon election scenarios. What would have happened if Oregon, and not Florida, had been the state under national scrutiny in November? And what election reform proposals are currently under consideration at the local, state, and federal levels? Secretary Bradbury.
It's a great pleasure to be here, and I particularly appreciate the introduction because it's exactly on point. And I was really intending to give a speech today about how Oregon couldn't be Florida, about how the chaos that we saw across the country last November could never happen here at home. I plan to announce proudly that our state is enacting reforms to provide our voters with the best election system in the country. But today, looking at where election reform stands in the state legislature and in the U.S. Congress, I simply can't give that speech. Back in January, election reform was on everyone's lips. The controversy in Florida that was still very fresh in citizens' minds threw a bright light on the weaknesses in the nation's election system. As reporters busily recounted ballots in Florida, columnists filled endless newspaper inches with critical analyses of antiquated voting systems. Citizens groups held rallies and press conferences decrying the disillusionment and the disenfranchisement of voters. And election reform was political gold for elected officials across the country as each clamored to be the first to propose a bill to eliminate punch cards. In the early months following the election, dozens of bills were filed in Congress calling for bipartisan commissions and federal funding for reform. More than 1,500 election reform bills were introduced by state legislators across the country. In Oregon alone, over 140 election-related bills were proposed by more than 50 state legislators. But at both the state and the federal level, what started as a spirited cry for reform has really now dwindled to a half-hearted whisper. Election reform efforts really once were shaped by bipartisanship and a dramatic sense of urgency. Those efforts are now bogged down in partisan wrangling, declining state revenues, and procrastination. President Bush's proposed budget set aside no money for federal aid to improve elections. The U.S. House and the U.S. Senate have an opportunity to amend the president's budget to adopt their own budget resolution, and in both those houses in the last month, resolutions to include funding for election reform were specifically defeated by the members of the U.S. Congress. The Congressional Election Reform Committee, initially conceived as a bipartisan effort by House Speaker Dennis Hastert and House Minority Leader Dick Gephardt, has splintered into several committees that are divided by party lines. And how do you think that the Oregon legislature has responded to the mess we all went through in Florida? We made a special request, or a request in the budget process for a small increase in our elections division budget to fund some much needed fixes in our election system. What was the legislature's response? Not only did they not fund a slight increase in our budget, but they actually cut the budget of the elections division. Never mind sweeping reform or new initiatives. They gave the elections division fewer resources for the next 2 years. Now, this legislature clearly does have the opportunity to make a significant difference in the accessibility, the accuracy, and the security of elections here in Oregon. And we just can't let that opportunity slip by. We're really at a critical turning point in the history of elections in this country and in this state. When you think about it, before last November, really the only thing that concerned citizens was who they were voting for. And now we have people worried about how they're voting. And very clearly now, after Florida, almost every voter has an opinion on that subject of how they're voting. Not who they're voting for, but how they're voting. Nationwide, a survey of citizens showed that a majority of them report low confidence in the election system. In a national poll conducted last December by CBS News, fully 80% of Americans said they believe the system for counting votes is not as accurate as it could be. Fully 80% said that that's what they believe in terms of elections. And then when they were asked whether they'd be willing to have the government spend, quote, a lot of money, unquote, to improve the way votes are cast and counted, 54% of the people in the national survey said yes, spend the money, make the election system work. So our citizens have clearly indicated that they don't have faith in the accuracy of our election system. And what's more, they feel strongly enough about the importance of elections that they're willing to commit some of their tax dollars to fix the problem. We really do have a public mandate for election reform, and we really have got to pay attention to it. Now, I've been working on two elections proposals that would create the kind of real reform the public is so clearly seeking. I'd like to briefly outline those two proposals and discuss why they're so critical for the future of elections in our state. One of my priorities is to phase out the use of punch cards in Oregon. We've got 7 of Oregon's 36 counties that still use punch cards. 3 of the 4 largest counties in Oregon, Multnomah, Clackamas, Washington, not Multnomah, excuse me, Lane, Clackamas, Washington, are included in the group that use punch cards, and that means that 40% of Oregon's voters cast their votes using punch cards. Punch cards are simply not voter friendly in a vote-by-mail environment. It's that simple. They're not voter friendly when you're voting by mail. Now, we learned from watching Florida that there are plenty of problems with punch cards even in polling place elections, but they make even less sense when voters receive them by mail. I don't know how many of you live here in Clackamas or Washington County, but picture here you get your ballot and your ballot booklet at home, and you've got your ballot booklet in one hand and you've got your punch card in the other hand, and you have to put your glasses on to find the right numbers on the card, and then you read on the card, you figure out which hole corresponds to which position for which item on the ballot, and that can in fact be a very difficult process. At minimum, it's very time-consuming, but even more time-consuming if you really want to double-check how you voted and see if you made a mistake. Now, if you do discover that you made a mistake on a punch card ballot, guess what? You've got to call or go down and visit your county elections office to get a new one. So you've got to be an incredibly committed voter if you punch one Chad wrong and you don't want that to be reflected in how you voted. So I think more than that, more than the difficulty and the lack of voter friendliness, the most critical reason to phase out punch cards is that they do not adequately record our voters' intent. Based on a study conducted by the Oregonian, my office then, after the Oregonian study, examined the rate of undervotes or ballots with no vote counted for president in each county in Oregon. We found that the rate of undervotes was 2% in the 7 counties that still use punch cards. That 2% is compared to only 1% in the 29 counties that use other voting technology. Now, 2% may sound small, but it's still double the rate of undervotes in non-punch card counties. That means that 40% of our voters who live in punch card counties may not have an equal opportunity to have their voice heard. And I take that very, very seriously. As we clearly saw in Florida, a margin of far less than 1% of the total ballots can be the critical difference in deciding the outcome of a race. In fact, overall, there were 25,000 Oregon ballots with no vote counted for president. The margin between Al Gore and George W. Bush in Oregon was 6,765 votes. What that means is that the number of votes, the ballots cast with no vote for president that was discernible, that number was significantly larger statewide than the number of votes that decided who was elected president in Oregon. I think that's a fundamental issue in terms of having faith in the election system. Now, I look at that number and I think back to Florida and all the chaos that was there, and I realize, there but for the grace of God go I. Election boards here in Oregon could have been combing through ballot after ballot in a recount here rather than Florida. CNN could have been camped out on my office steps instead of in the office of Catherine Harris. Now, I think it's quite clear that we've got to get rid of punch cards if we want to guarantee that what happened in Florida could never happen here at home. My second critical election reform proposal is the implementation of a centralized voter registration system. Oregon's voter rolls are currently housed in 36 separate county databases, and there's no real connection between those databases. We really don't have any easy or efficient way to check for an overlap between these databases. Under the current decentralized system, if a voter wants to update their registration, county elections officials have to call the voter's former county of residence to verify that they live there and then change their registration. Now, Oregon law allows voters to update their registration and receive ballots right up until 8 o'clock on election night, and I strongly support that provision in Oregon law because I think it's a very important piece of our efforts to increase voter participation, to increase voter turnout. But last November, go back to last November, remember the local TV stories. We had thousands of voters, a line 2 blocks long outside Multnomah County Elections Office, and they were there at their county elections office to update their registration and vote during the last few days of the election. County officials had to make thousands of phone calls to verify the validity of those ballots before they could count them. They were provisional ballots until they'd verified their registration. And that took days after the election to complete. So when you have a presidential race that's divided by 6,000 votes statewide, and you've got Multnomah County checking thousands of provisional ballots, it slows down your ability to make the final call in terms of what happened in Oregon. Now, with the centralized system, when a voter registers at a new address in a new county, a county elections official would be able to do a real-time search of the entire state's voter registration system to find out really quickly and really easily if the voter was already registered somewhere else, and hence they could get the ballot in that county. And you could also find out whether or not the voter had already voted. A centralized voter registration system would thus dramatically increase the speed of Oregon's ballot count. It would also give Oregon amongst the cleanest voting rolls in the country and significantly reduce the possibility of voter fraud. The end result would be a real increase in voters' confidence in their election process. Now, I've been working with a very broad bipartisan coalition of legislators who support phasing out punch cards and implementing a centralized voter registration system. Those are both bipartisan issues in Salem. But the difference between supporting those reforms in concept and actually funding those reforms is proving to be very significant. While legislators talk about their commitment to election reform, the bills that would actually fund those reforms languish on the so-called add-back list. The add-back list is a sort of wish list for unfunded bills. Add-back bills haven't been funded in the current budget proposal, but are kept alive for the possibility that additional funding will become available before the legislature goes home. Now, there are two very clear problems with waiting for add-backs to reform our election system. The first is that the election reform bills are not the only proposals on the add-back list. In fact, in order to balance interests in a tight budget year, leadership has placed so many programs on the add-back list that the state would have to deficit spend in order to fund even half of the items on the add-back list. And obviously you can't deficit spend in Oregon, so that's not going to happen. The second problem is that we have every reason to believe that the May state revenue forecast will be flat or even slightly down from the March revenue forecast. And that clearly reduces the possibility that add-back funding will ever be available. Now, folks and other legislators have suggested federal funding is the solution. Now, I got to tell you very honestly, if you'd asked me the question 4 weeks ago, I would have agreed with that there was a real likelihood that there would in fact be federal funding to help states implement needed reforms. But as time goes on, it is becoming readily apparent that federal funding won't be the silver bullet we were hoping for. Most congressional election reform committees have hit partisan speed bumps well before they even began to discuss programs or funding. If they can't even put together a coalition to study reform proposals, how are they going to manage to find the billions of dollars that states need to enact those reform proposals? The cost to phase out punch cards in the 7 Oregon counties that still use them is approximately $2 million. The cost to implement a statewide centralized voter registration system is approximately $7 million. Add those two together, you get a total of about $9 million in reforms that would significantly improve Oregon's election system. I'd really believe that it's time to stop hoping for money from heaven, whether from some miraculous shift in the state's economy or the gifts of a reunited Congress. If we truly care about the value of our democracy and the participation of our citizens, it's time for the state to step up to the plate. Now, it's interesting. In addition to meeting our responsibility to the state's voters, as everyone here knows, we're also accountable to the federal Constitution. The American Civil Liberties Union and several other civil rights groups have filed suits against the state governments of California, Florida, Georgia, and Illinois, claiming that their election systems violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and calling for remedies before the 2002 election, which is about a year away. The Equal Protection Clause broadly protects one of democracy's most sacred principles: one person, one vote. Equal protection is violated whenever states fail to accord equal weight to each voter, whether by failing to provide adequate voting technology to every voter in the first place, or by failing to use consistent standards in a recount. And I'm sure you can remember equal protection was the basis of the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Bush v. Gore, ending the Florida recount last December. The basic claim of the ACLU lawsuits is that there is a disproportionate risk that the votes of citizens in some precincts will not be counted simply by virtue of the voting equipment used in those precincts. Now, let me just remind you that there were twice as many undervotes in Oregon's punch card counties as there were in counties using other technologies. Sounds to me like there would be a pretty strong case that 40% of Oregonians who live in those counties aren't being provided with equal protection. Now, if our legislature goes home this session without doing anything to end the use of punch cards, Oregon, too, could be vulnerable to such a lawsuit. It's real clear that the timing of these recent lawsuits is a direct response to the slowdown in Congress and the slowdown in state legislatures. As citizen groups realize that election reform is beginning to fall off the radar screen, they're acting through the courts to keep it on the radar screen. But the simple reality is that we have the tools to solve this problem now. In fact, unlike a whole lot of problems, this is a problem we can solve by throwing money at it. And not even that much money. Remember, phasing out punch cards and implementing centralized voter registration would cost $9 million. $9 million is about 1/10 of 1% of the state's general fund budget. That 1/10 of 1% of the state general fund budget, that is the cost to restore our citizens' faith in the election system and ensure that every vote is, in fact, counted. Our voters should not have to wait another year or 2 or 10 for the legislature to take action. If our legislature can't commit to preserving the rights and principles of our democratic political system now, I really believe they are doing a disservice to the voters who elected them to office under that very same system. And if we can't make election reform a priority on the tails of a presidential election that so clearly demonstrated that flaws exist in our current system, when can we make these changes happen? Will it take another disputed election? Another controversial recount? We owe it to our citizens to assure them once and for all that Oregon cannot and Oregon will not ever be Florida. Thank you. First question.
Well, I must say, Bill, that was an extraordinarily thorough and careful dissertation on one of the most negative scenes in terms of our progress in solving a really important political question in this country that I've heard in a long time, and there's a lot of competition for that award in what's going on in our political system right now. It also makes it kind of hard to ask a question that doesn't sound extremely theoretical. But one thing that has interested me that is a little bit outside of of the mainstream of what you talked about is that Oregon has the I think completely unique position of having voting by mail in all elections. So it's not a situation that's shared by any other voting constituency in this country. And some of particularly the high-tech, more exotic methods for user-friendly voting, using computers and that sort of thing, seem to be incompatible with the idea of having voting by mail. And I wonder if that's something that question of whether there is any risk that our interest in voting by mail will be ended by voter process reform, if it ever happens, if that's something you give consideration to, and if you think that it's a concern.
Good question. Excellent question. And I had the opportunity to testify before Senator McCain's Commerce Committee a couple of months ago back in D.C. And then I had the opportunity to go and testify to the Presidential Commission on Election Reform chaired by former Presidents Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford. And we were actually in the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California. And the thing that's interesting is people were getting very excited at that meeting, and they were excited about it back in Washington, D.C. They were very excited about what's called touchscreen voting. We all know what ATMs are, right? So the idea is that you have polling places with touchscreens that are kind of like ATMs, and you vote on the touchscreen. And it won't let you overvote, and it'll certainly let you know if you're undervoting. And you have to consciously say, I don't want to vote. And then you don't have to in that race. But it was incumbent upon me to point out to them that different states vote differently. And before they get carried away with some new technology that works in a polling place, they better remember that different states do it differently. Particularly, obviously, Oregon, because we vote by mail. But that I think there's a real understanding on the part of the Congress that in fact our election system is one that it's run state by state, states working with local governments. And I think there is a real understanding of that. I don't think they're likely to shove a grand solution down our throat. I think they really do recognize that it's way too different around the country to just impose one solution that fits all. So it is a challenge for us to make sure that people understand that we don't have polling places anymore, that we vote by mail. And I think that one of the things that, in terms of technology, one of the things that's a very natural partner with vote by mail is internet voting. If we can get it so that it's secure and that it's free of hacking and other things like that, if we can get it that way, and we also have to have a centralized voter registration system, then you can have a mixture of internet voting and vote by mail, and people could either vote on their computer or vote by mail based on what they choose to do.
Hi, Bill. Chris Smith, club member. I've got a three-part question. It's 2 parts fiscal and 1 part political. Fiscal part number 1 is you talked about the $9 million investment to bring our systems up to snuff. You didn't talk about whether the operating costs change for the better or the worse. I think particularly from the central registry, it sounds like there may be some streamlining that might actually save costs in future years. I'd like to hear about that. Second is, as a one-time investment, is this something that would be available to do a bonded kind of thing rather than biting into the next biennium for the whole bill? And then the political question is, I get about 10 emails a week asking me to write to my legislators about this transportation bill, that land use reform, health care. Nobody's sending me email asking me to write to my legislators about ballot reform. Is there a political impetus behind this, and where do I sign up if there is?
Good question. Well, let's talk first about Oregon centralized voter registration and the cost. It costs about $7 million up front to implement it. There are savings immediately from, in terms of the cost of counties having to check out people's registration on provisional ballots and the like. There's also the sort of priceless value of having a greater faith in our election system. Could we bond it? Yeah, you could. I mean, it's a one-time cost. It's kind of like building a building. So yes, you could. I would be very honest with you and tell you that I've never been a huge fan of bonding, because the reality is bonds just cost more money over time. So it's like too easy a solution to say, oh, we can just bond it and not pay for it. Well, guess what? You're going to pay for it and then some. So that's, I mean, it's a possibility, but I don't go there if I can avoid it. Political support in terms of the issues, I think it's very clear that we don't have 300 people on the Capitol steps every other day demanding funding for election reform, and that's correct. A lot of people were concerned about it when it was very much in the public eye. Now it's kind of like, well, I don't have constituents demanding that like I have for other kinds of services. So the challenge is to make sure that people recognize that election reform is just fundamental to the operations of a good democratic system. And I could suggest you call my legislative coordinator, Ed Dennis, in Salem, and I'm sure he'd love to keep you posted on what's going on and love to send you emails about encouraging your support or opposition to certain bills.
Okay, very good. I'd rather bond this than a baseball stadium.
Got it.
Lloyd Marbett, City Club member. Bill, congratulations on winning the election.
Well, it's wonderful to see you again. Thank you. Thank you.
I appreciate your comments on eliminating the punch cards and centralizing the voter registration system. I agree with you. And we actually debated, not so much the punch cards because no one had that prescience, but we debated the centralized voter system at the time we were running for office. But my definition of election reform is much broader than this. My definition also includes adopting instant runoff, which is provided for in Oregon's Constitution. It's been there over 80 years. And it also, my definition includes real campaign finance reform that takes corporate contributions out of candidate elections and also puts limitations on individual contributions. Now, both of these proposals are also in the legislature, and just like the proposals that you're addressing today, they're going nowhere as well. Now, my response has been to sponsor initiatives, and there's been 2 of them sponsored on this. My question to you is what is your position on these other reforms? And also, like you propose for initiatives, why not put together a citizens summit to help lobby on election reform in Oregon and actively solicit the involvement of citizens in helping bring these proposals out?
So Lloyd, let me just make sure I understand your question. So you're asking about reforms, specifically what would be my position on instant runoff?
That's right.
A, and B, Mark Haas has an amendment, for example, to the Oregon Constitution that allows the state to then, under our Constitution, regulate campaign finance.
There's a bill in the legislature also on instant runoff.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that, but it's real clear that in order to get to instant runoff, we do have it in the Constitution. That's correct. And in order to get to it, we have to, something has to be enacted by the legislature to allow the counties to do that kind of a system.
Right.
I would tell you very honestly, I have very mixed feelings about it. I see a real benefit to allowing people to say their first choice and then their second choice, and and then their first choice doesn't make it, they get to vote for their second choice. There's some real benefits to that. There are also, as you could understand, some huge complications in terms of vote counting. So, it's a software issue more than anything, but
Which, by the way, would be addressed with replacing punch cards and going to those kind of voting machines.
Yeah, that's okay. Well, that's true. The other thing is I'm a very strong supporter of Mark Haas's amendment to the Oregon Constitution that would not say that regulating campaign finance, it would say that campaign finance is not free speech. That's basically what his amendment says. The Oregon Constitution is probably the strictest in America when it comes to free speech protections. I love that, but I think it's kind of a problem, a big problem in elections. So I'm a supporter of Mark Haas's amendment to see that we could move in the direction of having good campaign finance, control.
Thanks.
It's nice to see you, Lloyd.
Nice to see you too.
Hello, my name is Andrew Rosenthal. I'm on the Lincoln High School Constitution team.
Congratulations. Yes.
My question involves disenfranchised voters. One of the issues in the Florida election were convicted felons who had been either rightfully or unrightfully cleared off the voting rolls. I'm wondering what the provisions are in Oregon for convicted felons. Are they allowed to vote? And if no, what the specifics are, and then how many citizens of Oregon didn't vote because of this?
Oregon law says that if you are housed in a state corrections facility, you can't vote. But if you were a convicted felon, you served some time, you're now on parole, you can vote. So basically, the way we control whether felons vote or not is that if they have an address of state, Oregon State Penitentiary, Salem, Oregon, they don't get a ballot. It's really that simple. But once they're out of the prison, once they're not housed in the prison, they are eligible to vote.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Scott Juan. I am also from Lincoln High School Constitution team.
Woo!
Yes, election reforms, though is a concern of mine, a greater concern is the fact that a significant percent of the population don't even vote. Do you believe there should be a mandatory legislation as in Australia?
Well, I hadn't gone that far. But, actually, it's interesting you raised that, because one of the things I've been real involved with and worked real hard on is to increase voter participation. And I've been out to over 50 high schools doing an exercise with them about why it matters that they vote and explaining why if we look at Oregon today, in a low turnout election, 60% of the voters are over the average age of the voter is 50. And in a high turnout election like we just had last November, the average 50, it's a higher 50% of the people voter average age is 50. So, and if you look at the registered vote, the age class of 18 to infinity, in terms of who can vote, the average, if you looked at people who are over 50, you'd be 43% of the people. So we clearly are weighted toward older folks voting, myself included, not younger folks. So I work to go out to the high schools, work very closely with the Oregon Student Association, and they have a lot to be proud of because they set the goal of having 27,000 additional students register and vote, not just register, and vote, and they exceeded their goal. So there's things we can feel good about in terms of efforts. We can also feel good about vote by mail. It's increased participation. And you see in the primary we just had, we've had just a steady decline in participation. And as you remember, in May of last year, there really wasn't much of an issue about who our presidential candidates were going to be. So that didn't bring up the turnout. But vote by mail and the fact that we have a double majority law that required citizens in school districts all over the state to get voters out to vote to pass their levies. That dramatically increased turnout. So I think there's a whole series of things that we can do to increase turnout. I'm particularly proud of the Oregon Student Association and the work they did to really increase younger people's participation.
Thank you.
Hi, Bill.
Hey, hi, Bob.
I'm Bob Shoemaker, member of the club. Another function of your office is that little thing called redistricting, which comes up every 10 years, this being one of those 10 years. And it's particularly fun when we have a member of one party in your office and the other party controlling the legislature. Could you give us a little preview of what we can expect in the next couple of months?
No. The legislature, under the Oregon Constitution, the legislature has until the end of June to adopt a plan redrawing district lines for the legislature, House and Senate. They have until the end of June to do that and get the governor to accept it. If they don't succeed, and they haven't succeeded for the last 30 years doing it, but I'm always hopeful. If they don't succeed, the Secretary of State then has to do redistricting, redraw legislative House and Senate boundaries reflecting the new census population in 45 days. And so, congressional districts too? No. Congressional districts are either done by the legislature or they're done by the federal courts. The congressional districts don't go the same route as state redistricting. So the legislature's working, actually they're working, I mean, you don't hear much about it, but they're working real hard at it. They're about to announce they're about to announce some draft plans, and we'll see how much they can bring together between the Republican caucus's plan and the Democratic caucus's plan.
Are you hopeful to be able to do it?
Excuse me, that's
Well, I have to tell you, I'm hopeful that the legislature does it because I got to tell you, 45 days redistricting the entire state of Oregon is it's not my idea of a good summer vacation.
Hi, Bill.
Hey, Walt.
Walt Roberts, City Club member. My question goes back to one of Lloyd's questions that you didn't get to answer. And it also goes to the first questioner's point, too. Is there something happening or something that could be done to bring people who are interested in this together for a summit? Or is there some sort of a action committee that could be beating the drum and getting the word out? So the question is do you see some merit in bringing together a forum, a summit, something to bring attention to the subject while it's still lukewarm and cooling? And or is there something you could see to do out of your office or invite somebody to do to organize an effort to drum up some interest and some appropriate pressure about the mechanics of elections?
Election reform.
Yeah.
I think it would be very appropriate, as Lloyd talked about, and as I talked about in the campaign, I think it would be very appropriate to bring some parties together to really look at the initiative and referendum process in Oregon. And I know this club has been very involved with that in those issues. So I think that would make some real sense to do that. Part of the challenge is that you don't necessarily have something that really brings a lot of parties together. That's part of the challenge, is there's not some unifying reality that everybody thinks needs to be changed. There are those who think the initiative process is absolutely fine the way it is. There are the others who don't. So.
My question was really about election mechanics, the subject of your speech.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Not the initiative.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Well, yeah, we could bring people together on election mechanics. The reality is the legislature's in session. They'll stay in session for another 2 months and they'll go home. So if we don't get it done, we wait 2 years. So if we don't get it done in the legislature, I think it would then make sense to get some people together. And one of the things we have a bill in to create a task force in the interim on English as a second language. Because under the National Voting Rights Act, if any county has more than 5% of their population that has difficulty with English, and the largest group is Hispanic folks, If the census shows that over 5% of any county is people who have problems with English, you then have to provide them a ballot and voting materials in their language. California has 6 such languages that meet that 5% test in any one county. And it's very possible that Oregon will, in fact, meet that threshold this time. We don't know yet from the census, but it's certainly possible. And that's something we certainly are going to be looking at.
Hi, I'm David Dickey Griffith. I'm a member of the Lincoln High School Constitution team.
Yes. Right.
My question is twofold. First of all, does Oregon law require a mandatory recount within a certain percentage for the victory? And second of all, if such a recount were to take place, is there any way in which we can avoid the partisanship which took place in Florida?
Great question. First of all, Oregon law says that you automatically do a recount if the margin between the two candidates is less than 1/5 of 1%. In the case of president last time, that would have been about 3,000 votes. So if it had been less than 3,000 votes, we would have had an automatic recount. Now, there's a fundamental difference in Oregon election law and Florida election law as it relates to recounts. First thing is, the Secretary of State has one piece of discretion in this whole recount area, and that's the manner that the recount is done. And for the last 100 years, and include myself in that category, for the last 100 years, Secretaries of State have ordered hand recounts. So that's number one. And I ordered a hand recount in the spring between Gary Brubaker and Randall Edwards for treasurer, and I would continue to do that. Now, what's interesting is what we have in Oregon is what I'd call. Do you remember seeing all these boards, looking at cards? And there's a fundamental difference between the way Oregon sets up election boards and the way Florida sets up election boards. In Florida, there are 3 members on an election board. In a heavily Democratic county, 2 of those members are Democrats and one of them is a Republican. In heavily Republican counties, it's 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat. That's their bipartisan election board. And how many people does it take to make a decision? 2. So guess what? Either party, and whichever the dominant party is, makes the decision. In Oregon, there are 4 members on an election board, 2 from each of the 2 major parties, and it takes 3 people to make a decision. So you have to have some bipartisan support to make a decision determining a voter's intent. That would be a huge difference. Now, the other thing about recounts that I think is critical, and is what led to the Supreme Court ruling in Florida, stopping the Florida recount, is in Oregon, you can't just recount one county in a presidential race. You have to recount every vote that was cast for president. So you have to do 36 counties, you have to do all of them. And until you do all 36 counties and recount every vote, no vote changes. So the situation we saw in Florida where, this county's votes changed and that vote is counted, not here.
Glad to hear it. Thank you.
Okay, and then
Hi, Alex Stewart from the Lincoln Constitution team.
Yay!
Thank you. You spoke earlier of the principle of one person, one vote, and so I'd like to ask you basically the Electoral College question. There's a lot of issues surrounding it. In fact, one of them is that Oregon, if the Electoral College was going to be removed and the popular elections would occur for the president, Oregon would most likely receive less representation in the Electoral College per voter. So my question to you is then, regarding the principle of one person, one vote, and regarding the fact that Oregon would probably lose some representation, would you support eliminating the Electoral College?
No. And I'll give you an answer. We are the United States of America, and we are